What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's talk about Marvel Snap's newest card, Punisher War Machine. This armored amalgamation is one of the weirdest cards in Marvel Snap. It's got a 2/2 stat line, so it's not impacting the board heavily, but it has a very weird function. When you draw it, it marks a location that you don't have any cards. If all of your locations have cards, it will not mark a location. That marked location shows up for both you and your opponent, so both of you know what the location is. Then, if you're winning that location and you have Punisher War Machine on the board, his objective will trigger. This objective gives you +1 energy for the entire rest of the game. This is a very interesting dynamic in terms of how Punisher War Machine is meant to play out, because you don't necessarily have to win it the turn you play him. You can win it at any time and get that energy whenever you want. This makes Punisher War Machine an interesting card, not just for ramping on 2, but for maybe doing things that are a little bit more different and odd. But of course, as a turn 2 ramp card, there are some notable pieces of utility that it gives you access to. A lot of cheap ramp cards are best used to jump all the way to 5, and Punisher War Machine is definitely no exception. This is also a card that wants to be played in a deck that is taking priority very, very early. That means that you can follow up the Punisher War Machine with cards that are exceedingly powerful and exceedingly cheap. Cards like Martyr and Ebony Maw are actually the kind of things that you want to see. However, his own 2/2 stat line does hold him back in a meaningful way. This is not a card that's realistically going to face up to 2 3s, and that's a problem because basically every other utility 2 in the game that you're going to see people playing, from Ascani Sun to Iron Patriot, is going to be able to equal or better him. That is largely the biggest problem that you run into when you're playing this card. It's cool, it's interesting, it does some nice stuff, but I can't really shake the feeling that this is a card that has 1 point of power too few to be as powerful as it otherwise could be. I also can't shake the feeling that that's probably good design, because if everyone was getting 1 energy for free, that would be a really unpleasant metagame to play in. With that said, let's take a look at how some high infinite players are using Punisher War Machine. First up, I've been playing him in the Butt Virus deck in place of Ascani Sun. This is a fairly reasonable switch because this deck is very easily able to aim for priority, and Ascani Sun asks us to not play Virus on him for a much longer period of time than Punisher War Machine does. We are giving up 1 point of power, but once that objective is completed, we can freely Virus away Punisher War Machine without worrying about losing out on extra value, unlike with Ascani Sun. I think they're roughly equivalent here. Maybe Punisher War Machine is a mild upgrade, but I also think that this is a perfectly playable deck if you are playing pretty much anything else that you want in that 2-drop slot. While I do think Punisher War Machine is good here, there are a couple of specific situations that he makes the deck seriously better. Most of those situations involve the games where you are Mother Ascaniing an Ozymandias, which happens a lot because most of the other cards in your deck are things you can play out. So 2 targets that you end up hitting a lot are Ozymandias and Shadow King, and having that extra energy is really helpful when you're trying to play multiple Aussies onto the board. That is a notable upgrade that he brings. I think that it's very even between him and Ascani Sun, with maybe a slight edge to him. This is a deck that is able to use him very, very well and is not really going out of its way to build off of him, which I think is largely the correct way to approach trying to play a card like this. When you're going out of your way to build off of Punisher War Machine, you end up committing pretty hard to being a deck that needs the energy in order to function. This deck is doing the opposite. You don't need the energy in order to function, you have the energy, and it allows you to function slightly better. There's not really much of a downside risk, and you don't need to overinvest in making sure you win your Punisher War Machine lanes. You could just kind of let him sit there and be kind of okay because you turn bad bodies into good bodies with Techno-Organic Virus anyway. This is a card that you're basically playing because you can and because he does help. But this is also a deck that is going to enable you to get a couple of little upgrades off of Punisher War Machine when you're able to complete the quest. Like maybe you get an extra play of Techno-Organic Virus when you don't have a Mobius and it's a little more expensive than you would like. Or maybe you're able to fit a 7 energy play of Ozymandias plus a Shadow King that you got off of Mother Ascani that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. That ends up being more points than something you would otherwise be playing. But mostly it's marginal upgrades like that. Another version of the list that I ran into on ladder was one that I believe Chamo was playing, and I think this is a very Chamo deck. It's a very reasonable mid-range deck that is looking to attack the metagame in sort of awkward ways. One of the things that Punisher War Machine is bringing to this deck is the addition of Professor X type shenanigans. This is particularly relevant in a world where so many things are able to do combo levels of point output on the final turn of the game, and you are able to get serious lockdown output out of a Professor X. It can be dangerous in those tempo mirrors, but typically the way this deck is set up is that it has just slightly better cards for those aggressive situations. Ideally, what you're trying to do is lock down one lane with Professor X, lock down another lane with either Alioth or Negasonic. This is a time-honored strategy that has been around in Marvel Snap for ages. If anything, the deck this reminds me of the most is the old-school 2023 Thanos deck that was playing things like Spider-Man when he got rid of a lane or got rid of your opponent's ability to play on a lane, and Professor X to be played off of a Psylocke on turn 2 and Time Stone. Those are generally the things that this deck is reminding me of. It's much more about the I would like to get that extra energy, use the Professor X stuff, and what it's really keying off of is actually something that the Batroc Professor X deck is also keying off of, which is just that Professor X is kind of nice right now. There are a lot of combo decks that are just like, okay, I'm going to play something in one lane the entire game. I'm sitting here doing my Captain Carter thing. You Professor X them, they're just going to lose at least one location, and if you can figure out how to lock down the other one with some combination of Alioth and Negasonic, you are going to beat those decks. That play pattern is what you're really trying to attack when it comes to being a deck like this. It can get a little dicey in tempo mirrors, but generally I do think this is a reasonable direction for things to go for a deck that is doing what this deck is doing. It's definitely surprising to get Professor X'd, and Daredevil will scale in Professor X lanes fairly reasonably. You can also still play skills. You can play things like a Techno-Organic Virus in that Professor X lane if you have already locked down that location. That's not a play you're going to do all the time, because sometimes your opponents might play something on the final turn of the game that would add stuff to a Professor X location, but most of the time they're just not doing that, and getting rid of the Professor X ongoing doesn't actually affect you in a negative way. Another deck that's particularly interesting with the Punisher War Machine is a full lockdown deck like this one from Cougar. It is an interesting list that allows you to access a couple of turn 2 ramp cards that should ideally get you the ability to bring back the old Storm War Machine Legion combo. Even outside of that, doing Iska stuff with a Storm protecting her is a powerful thing to do. Being able to do Storm Iska, then War Machine Infinite something, that's just gonna win a lot of games. It's a very powerful play. There are lots of decks that are dealing with things that are doing Iska with things like Shadow King, right? Like that butt tempo deck really wants to Shadow King your Iska. If they can't Shadow King your Iska, well, you're going to lose that lane. And so just straight up playing for 2-lane Marvel Snap, we're back in a mode where that is a very reasonable thing to do. A lot of this is for the same reasons that Professor Xers are so good right now. There's a lot of these decks that are just like, I'm going to do my combo. It's going to be the thing I do on the final turn of the game. I'm not really outputting points before then. You can really punish those decks by locking down lanes. And then if you're able to win a lane that remains on the board, which the Infinite is particularly potent at doing, you can make things happen. This is also a deck that can play a very unfair game plan when you actually pull it off. Storm War Machine Legion is super duper messed up, and you should still be afraid of people who can do that. It's sort of like halfway between a ramp deck and a Storm War Machine Legion deck, so it's got plenty of point output, but also has the ability to just absolutely close out games, prevent anything from happening on the final turn, and bring back one of the more toxic combos in the history of Marvel Snap. Punisher War Machine is really just a second thing that allows us to get towards that. If we can get the Punisher War Machine active, all we need is the ability to play a 5-drop on 4, and suddenly we are back in business. It's the kind of thing that can only really work when your opponents aren't particularly contesting you, so there are some upsides and downsides, but when they are contesting the Punisher War Machine, you have Storm, Iska, and the Infinite, and that usually works against the decks that are able to do that. Last up is Zombie Galacti, which loves basically anything it can convert into extra energy. Zombie Galacti, of course, costing 7 is the biggest downside of this card. I think if this card cost 6, you'd actually see a ton of Zombie Galacti decks. And so Zombie Galacti costing 7 is the kind of thing you can really offset, not just by reducing its cost, but also just by getting extra energy. This just makes Zombie Galacti a much more reasonable deck. We were already doing Adam Warlock stuff in this shell. You have so many little guys that you can move around or use as pieces pieces. You get to transform a lot of the things that would otherwise be overcommitments into lanes by doing that. I actually think that this is the deck that I'm the most confident he's an upgrade in. He's just a nice little piece of additional energy ramp to go on top of your other energy ramp, because you want basically all of the things you can get. This deck has two goals: get to 7 energy and make Zombie Galacti big, and that's really all you really have the ability to try to do. The other thing that this deck does that I like as a Zombie Galacti deck is not be a Magic deck. I realize Magic is a great card for Zombie Galacti. I hate trying to do it in the world we currently live in because there are so many easy ways to get rug pulled for 8 cubes. I don't like getting rug pulled for 8 cubes. It's a tough scene. I would like to avoid that if possible. So because of that, we have a much more streamlined version, courtesy of Jay Walla, that allows us to do a lot of solid tempo stuff and still have the ability to play Zombie Galacti without any worries about like, oh, my opponent played a Mobius, I can't play my stuff. Nope, you have 7 energy. You have the energy. It's okay. You'll be able to play the guy. So overall, Punisher War Machine feels like a pretty medium plus card. There's definitely situations that I think he's helpful in, but I don't really know how many of those situations are going to come up for you. He seems pretty specific. You need certain cards to build around him if you want to build around him as a payoff, and you need certain cards in your collection if you want to even really consider playing him. He kind of only goes in certain spots. I'm a little compelled by the butt deck that's just like able to run him as an additional piece, but that's definitely not a Punisher War Machine deck. It's a deck that can run Punisher War Machine. Overall, I'd say this is a reasonable card, but it's hardly one that you're going to want to try to go out there and break the bank on. This is a card that has not proven itself to have an incredible high-level output game yet, and although the Galacti and Lockdown stuff is promising, I don't know that I can concretely say that it's going to be able to make it worth doing. With that said, thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. If you enjoyed that, please remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.